You are trapped inside a pitch-black box made of solid snow. 10 other people are crushed tightly against the dark. The cold is no longer uncomfortable. It is actively trying to kill you. Your only oxygen comes through a tiny hole punched into the ceiling with a ski pole. If the hole collapses, everyone suffocates. If you fall asleep, your body quietly shuts down. And somewhere in this darkness, someone is going to die first. High above Oregon, Mount Hood looks beautiful from a distance. From the city below, it feels calm, silent, untouchable. But the mountain has a reputation climbers never forget. Its weather can change so violently that the world simply disappears around you. In May 1986, 15 sophomores from the Oregon Episcopal School arrived at the base of the mountain. They were teenagers, not elite mountain. The climb was part of the school's wilderness program. To graduate, students had to complete a summit. The group was led by experienced adults, including a professional climbing guide and a trusted school chaplain. Everything about the trip appeared controlled, safe, routine. At 3 a.m., the group began the final ascent beneath a black sky. They strapped on crampons, tied themselves together with climbing rope, and moved upward across the frozen slopes. The weather forecast predicted light snow. It was catastrophically wrong. By sunrise, the mountain turned hostile. Barometric pressure crashed. Wind ripped across the exposed glacier at nearly 60 miles per hour. Snow blasted sideways through the air so aggressively that visibility collapsed into nothing. This was not bad weather anymore. It was a full whiteout. The horizon vanished. The trail vanished. Even the climbers standing a few feet apart struggled to see one another. At nearly 10,000 feet, the group was suddenly trapped inside a moving wall of snow. The temperature dropped hard. Several students immediately began showing signs of severe hypothermia. Their hands stopped functioning properly. Their speech slowed. Some began shaking so violently they struggled to stay upright. A few students turned back early with an assistant guide, but 11 people remained high on the mountain, and now they faced an impossible decision: keep moving blindly through zero visibility and risk walking directly off a cliff, or stop completely and hope the mountain allowed them to survive the night. The lead guide understood the reality immediately. Trying to descend in a whiteout was suicide, so he made the only decision that gave them any chance at all. They would dig into the mountain itself. It sounds like a standard survival procedure. For this group, it became a frozen nightmare. The climbers found a shallow depression in the snowpack and dropped to their knees. Exhausted and already freezing, they used small plastic shovels, gloved hands, and climbing gear to claw through the hard-packed snow. The wind screamed over their heads. Their gloves soaked through. Their fingers went numb. After hours of digging, they managed to hollow out a tiny cavity beneath the surface. It was barely large enough to fit a dining room table. The ceiling hung only a few feet above their heads. It wasn't a shelter, it was a survival coffin. One by one, 11 people crawled into the cramped darkness. There was no room to stretch, no room to lie down, no room to escape each other. Bodies were pressed so tightly together that if one person shifted position, everyone had to move with them. Before sealing themselves inside, the guide used a ski pole to punch a narrow shaft through the ceiling. That tiny opening became their entire connection to the outside world, their only air, their only chance. Then the storm buried the entrance, and Mount Hood swallowed them whole. The first night inside the cave was brutal. Everyone was soaked. Hours of digging through heavy snow had drenched their jackets, gloves, and boots. In freezing conditions, wet clothing becomes a silent weapon. Water pulls heat out of the human body at terrifying speed. Inside the cramped cave, the temperature kept falling. The students tried huddling together for warmth, pressing shoulder against shoulder, knees against chests, but there was no comfortable position. Every muscle cramped, every movement disturbed someone else. The darkness was complete. No sunlight, no horizon, no sense of time, just breathing and the constant sound of wind roaring somewhere above the snow. At first, the cave felt like protection. Then the air started becoming the problem. 11 people trapped inside a space barely larger than a closet were breathing the same oxygen over and over. Every breath replaced oxygen with carbon dioxide. The tiny ventilation shaft kept clogging with drifting snow. Every few minutes, someone had to reach upward and clear the opening with frozen hands, because everyone understood the terrifying reality. If that hole sealed shut while they slept, they would never wake up. Nobody truly rested. The students drifted in and out of exhaustion, trembling violently inside soaked clothes. Some whispered prayers into the darkness. Others quietly cried. The chaplain tried keeping morale alive, speaking softly, reassuring the terrified teenagers that rescue teams would eventually come. But nobody knew how long the storm would last, and Mount Hood was getting warm. By morning, the blizzard above them had intensified. Wind speeds climbed higher. Snow buried every visible landmark. The guide understood something the students didn't. Waiting too long could kill everyone. Food was limited, body temperatures were crashing, and rescue crews would never find them if nobody knew their exact location. He made a desperate decision. He would leave the cave. One student volunteered to go with him. The plan was brutally simple. Blindly descend the mountain, find rescuers, bring them back. Before leaving, the guide reassured everyone inside the cave. He told them to stay awake, keep clearing the air hole, stay together, promised he would return. Then the two disappeared into the whiteout. The remaining 9 students in the chaplain were suddenly alone, and that was when survival turned into psychological collapse. The temperature inside the cave continued dropping. Wet clothing stiffened into frozen fabric. Hands stopped working properly. Speech slowed. Hypothermia is terrifying because it doesn't simply freeze the body. It attacks the mind first. As core body temperatures dropped, confusion began spreading through the cramped shelter. Thoughts became slower. Judgment started failing. Some of the teenagers stopped responding normally. Then came something the surviving victim never felt. A medical phenomenon called paradoxical undressing. When the human brain becomes dangerously cold, it can misfire catastrophically. Victims suddenly feel overwhelming heat. Their freezing body convinces them they are burning alive. In the pitch-black cave, terrified teenagers began ripping off gloves, unzipping coats, pulling layers away from their bodies. They insisted they felt hot. The remaining survivors desperately tried stopping them. They pulled jackets back on, wrapped frozen arms in blankets, argued in the dark, but there was almost no room to move. Bodies were crushed tightly together. Panic spread through the cave. The living listened helplessly as breathing slowly changed around them. Violent shivering turned weak. Voices grew quieter, and one by one, the mountain began taking. The cramped shelter became even smaller. To stay close to the tiny air shaft, survivors had to shift upward inside the cave. Eventually, some found themselves sitting against bodies that no longer moved. Outside, the blizzard buried the mountain for a 3rd straight day. At the base, rescue teams had already launched a massive search operation. Helicopters waited on standby. Mountain rangers prepared climbing routes. Volunteers gathered emergency supplies. But the storm made rescue impossible. Pilots couldn't see. Climbers couldn't navigate. Search teams were essentially blind. Then rescuers made a devastating discovery. They found the guide and the student who left with him, frozen to death on the mountain. They had never made it down. The news hit Rescue Command like a shockwave, because if the guide was, the teenagers trapped inside the cave were almost certainly out of time. On the 4th day, the storm finally broke. The sky cleared. For the first time in days, Mount Hood stood silent beneath the sunlight. Miles of untouched white snow stretched across the upper glacier. To anyone looking from below, the mountain appeared peaceful, but somewhere beneath that frozen surface, rescuers believed an entire group of teenagers was buried alive. More than 100 rescuers climbed onto the mountain, carrying long aluminum avalanches. They spread out into a massive search line. Step, stab, step, stab. Again and again, metal rods punched deep into the snowpack, searching for anything unnatural. A backpack, a boot, a pocket of air, anything. Hours passed. Nothing. The glacier gave them only silence. No voices, no movement, no sign that anyone had survived. Some rescuers quietly started preparing for recovery instead of rescue. Then suddenly, one volunteer stopped moving. His metal probe had struck something soft beneath the snow. Not rock, not solid ice, something different. He pulled the rod free and stabbed again. Same resistance. The rescuer dropped to his knees. Others rushed toward him. Within seconds, shovels slammed violently into the snow. Nobody spoke. Nobody wanted to say what everyone was thinking, because after 4 days trapped in freezing darkness, nobody should still be alive. The rescuers tore through layers of compacted snow as fast as they could. Then, suddenly, the shovel broke through. A hollow space, a cave. Flashlights pierced the darkness below, and for a moment, nobody moved, because the rescuers couldn't immediately tell who was dead and who was still alive. Bodies were piled tightly together in complete silence. The freezing temperatures and constant moisture had stiffened clothing into frozen layers. Teenagers were tangled together so tightly they almost looked fused to one shape. Some had no jackets. Some wore only partial clothing. Their skin had turned pale blue. No movement, no sound. The cave felt less like a shelter and more like a grave. Rescuers climbed inside and began the agonizing process of separating bodies from one another. One by one, they lifted the teenagers onto the bright snow above. Medics checked for pulses. Nothing. Then the next. Nothing again. The rescue mission slowly shifted toward body recovery. Helicopters were called. Body bag prepared. Families below the mountain quietly began losing hope. Then one medic paused. He had been checking a 16-year-old boy named Giles. At first, he thought he imagined a tiny movement, so small it almost looked impossible. The medic immediately dropped to his knees and ripped off his glove. He pressed trembling fingers against the boy's neck. There it was, a pulse. Weak, slow, barely alive, but unmistakably human. The entire rescue operation changed instantly. They checked the girl beside him, Brinton, completely motionless. Her skin was ice cold. Her body temperature was catastrophically low. Then, a faint breath escaped her lips. She was alive too. The mountain had somehow failed to take everyone. What had started as a body recovery operation transformed into a frantic race against time. Helicopters landed immediately. The surviving teenagers were rushed off the glacier and flown directly to trauma centers in Portland. Doctors faced an almost impossible medical challenge. Severe hypothermia changes how the body dies. Warm a patient too quickly, and freezing toxic blood trapped in the limbs can surge back toward the heart, triggering sudden cardiac arrest. Doctors couldn't risk it. Instead, they used an aggressive experimental procedure. Blood was slowly removed from the teenagers' bodies, carefully warmed outside the body, and pumped back in. Hour after hour, doctors fought to pull them back from the edge. Outside the hospital rooms, families waited in silence. Nobody spoke much. Nobody expected miracles anymore. Then something impossible happened. Giles opened his eyes. Later, Brinton too. After nearly 4 days buried inside a frozen cave on Mount Hood, they survived. They had endured freezing temperature, collapsing oxygen, psychological breakdown, and the slow death of classmates around them. They had sat pressed against bodies in total darkness simply to stay close enough to breathe. They survived something medical science barely understood, but survival came with a cost that never disappeared. 9 people died on that mountain. 9 families lost children during what was supposed to be a school wilderness program. The tragedy permanently changed outdoor education programs across the country. Emergency locators some standard. High-altitude survival training changed forever. But rules do not erase memory. Giles and Brinton eventually recovered. They grew older, built lives, moved forward, at least on the outside, because survival leaves behind permanent ghosts. The frostbite heals. The headlines disappear. People stop asking questions. But somewhere deep inside memory, Mount Hood never truly ended. It is still dark, still freezing, still silent, and somewhere inside that buried cave beneath the snow, their friends are still there.